5 models stood in a perfect line, waiting for the billionaire's son to choose his new mother. But the boy looked past their beautiful faces, pointed straight at the quiet housemaid, and the reason for his choice holds a secret that will change how you think about family forever. The day the judge's hammer fell, the silence began. It started in the long, empty hallways of the Sterling mansion, where the echoes of family arguments had finally faded. Then, the silence crept into 7-year-old Leo. His laughter was the first thing to disappear, followed by his words. He moved like a little ghost through rooms big enough to hold 100 people, but now they only held a vast, cold quiet, and the boy who refused to speak. His father, Richard Sterling, was a man who commanded boardrooms and built empires from nothing. He could make a single phone call and change the stock market, but he could not buy a single word from his son. For weeks, Richard tried everything. He bought Leo a pony, a room full of video games, and even a small movie theater just for him. The toys sat untouched. The screens remained dark. Finally, one evening, Richard found Leo staring out his bedroom window at the city lights below. He sat beside his son, the space between them feeling wider than the entire city. "Leo, please." Richard's voice was softer than usual, stripped of its usual power. "Talk to me. What do you need? I'll buy it for you. Anything." Leo didn't look at him. In a voice as small as a whisper, he said, "I want a hug." Richard's heart ached with relief. He moved to embrace his son, but Leo shook his head. "Not from you, from Mom." Richard's face hardened. "You know she lives somewhere else now." Leo finally turned his gaze from the window, his eyes looking far older than 7. "She lives in a new house with her new husband. She got married last week." The words landed like stones. The divorce was because of this other man. Richard had tried to protect Leo from that detail, but the boy had known all along. The finality of it all crushed Richard. He saw then that his son didn't just miss his mother. He felt replaced, abandoned. Richard Sterling believed the solution was a new wife, a replacement mother to fix his broken family. We've all seen people try to fix a deep crack with just a new coat of paint, haven't we? It's funny how sometimes the biggest problems have the simplest answers, but we look for complicated ones instead. Have you ever known a time when a simple, quiet conversation could have solved everything, but someone made a huge, dramatic plan instead? Before he could begin the search for a new wife, Richard knew he needed help immediately. He needed someone in the house whose only job was Leo. 2 days later, a woman arrived. Her name was Clara. She didn't arrive in a shiny black car like Richard's other employees. She came on the 7 a.m. bus, holding a small, worn handbag. She was quiet and plain, and when she first saw Leo sitting silently in the grand living room, she didn't rush over to him with a fake, cheerful smile. She simply gave a small nod, then went to the kitchen. A few minutes later, she returned and placed a glass of milk and a single chocolate cookie on the small table beside him. She didn't say, "I made this for you," or "You should eat." She said nothing at all, and then she left the room to begin her work, leaving the boy to his silence. For an hour, the cookie sat there, but after Clara had gone upstairs, Leo's small hand reached out and picked it up. The single cookie became a silent conversation. The next morning, Clara left a small notepad and a freshly sharpened pencil on the table where Leo ate his breakfast. She had noticed him tracing the shapes of cars on the fogged-up window pane with his finger. She never said a word about it, and neither did he. But the next day, a carefully drawn picture of a blue truck was left on the kitchen counter, right where she would find it. This became their language. Some days it was a drawing. Other days it was Clara leaving him a slice of apple cut into the shape of a star, or Leo arranging his toy soldiers to face the kitchen, a silent hello as she worked. His words remained locked away, but his world was no longer empty. The vast mansion began to feel less like a museum and more like a quiet, safe space shared between two people. Richard Sterling saw the drawings that Clara carefully taped to the giant stainless steel refrigerator. He saw that his son no longer stared blankly at walls for hours. But Richard was a man who understood growth through charts and loud reports of success. To him, this gentle progress was too slow, too quiet. He saw a boy who was functional, not joyful. He mistook Leo's newfound peace for continued sadness, a problem that his simple, quiet housekeeper could manage but not solve. In his mind, Leo didn't need a gentle caretaker. He needed a vibrant force of nature to pull him back into the world of noise and laughter. His plan to find a wife wasn't just about him anymore. He convinced himself it was the only real cure. For his son, the cure he had in mind arrived one Tuesday afternoon in a screaming red sports car. Her name was Ingrid, a German model whose face was on billboards across Europe. The car's loud engine shattered the afternoon quiet before she even stepped out. She was a storm of expensive perfume, bright colors, and clicking heels that echoed on the marble floors like gunshots. She wasn't just beautiful, she was overwhelming, a living, breathing advertisement for a life of glamour and noise. "Richard, darling!" Her voice boomed through the entryway, making Leo, who who was reading a book in the living room, flinch. "And this must be the little one." She swept towards Leo, her charm turned up to its highest setting. She knelt before him, a cloud of silk and scent, and presented him with a heavy gold-plated model of her own sports car. It was a cold, perfect object. "Is it not divine?" she asked, not waiting for an answer. "You have your father's eyes. We will have so much fun, you and I. I will teach you how to pose for the cameras." She tried to pull him into a hug, but Leo instinctively took a step back, his small body rigid. His eyes darted across the room, searching for something familiar, and found Clara, who was silently gathering empty glasses from a side table. Clara met his gaze for only a second, but her expression was calm and steady. It was a silent message. "I am here. You are safe." Leo's shoulders relaxed just a little. Later that evening, after Ingrid had departed in another roar of her engine, Richard tried to sell the idea. "She's wonderful, isn't she, Leo? So much energy." He beamed, completely misreading the afternoon. He saw Leo's silence around Ingrid as simple shyness that would fade with time. He didn't see the fear in his son's eyes, nor did he understand the silent conversation his son had with the housekeeper. He saw a beautiful woman who could be a perfect mother and a shy boy who needed to be fixed. As Leo went upstairs to his room, Richard picked up his phone, a wide smile on his face as he called Ingrid to plan their next date. He was certain he was one step closer to rebuilding his family. Ingrid, the German model, was just the beginning. After a few weeks, her loud laugh was replaced by the soft French accent of a model named Amélie, who tried to teach Leo words he had no interest in learning. After Amélie came Tiffany from California, a woman who seemed more in love with her phone's camera than any person, taking endless photos of herself against the mansion's grand backdrops. To Leo, they were a blur of new perfumes, tapping high heels and bright, empty smiles. The house was no longer quiet. It was filled with the noise of strangers. But for Leo, it had never felt so lonely. His father was a ghost in his own home, often gone before Leo woke up and returning long after Leo was in bed, smelling of fancy restaurants and a woman's perfume. The brief questions Richard used to ask, "How was your day, son?" stopped altogether. He was too busy, too distracted, caught in a whirlwind of beautiful faces that all looked the same after a while. The fall semester at school started, and Leo's art teacher announced an exhibition for the parents. Leo's drawing of the blue truck, the first one he had ever shown to Clara, was chosen to be displayed. He was quiet, but a flicker of pride lit up his eyes when he told her. That evening, he found the courage to tell his father. Richard, busy on his phone planning a weekend trip to Aspen with his model of the week, barely looked up. "That's great, son. Really great." Leo hesitated, then added, "You're supposed to come tomorrow night." Richard finally looked at him and smiled a brilliant, confident smile. "Of course I'll be there, front row. I wouldn't miss it for the world." The promise hung in the air, shiny and full of hope. The next evening at the crowded school gymnasium, Leo stood beside his drawing. He watched the door, his heart jumping every time a new parent walked in. An hour passed, then another. The crowd started to thin. Richard's front row seat remained empty. The hope in Leo's chest slowly turned into a familiar, heavy ache. Just as he was sure no one would come for him, a figure appeared at the doorway, breathless and looking around anxiously. It was Clara, still in her simple work clothes. She had taken 2 buses across town after her shift ended. She walked straight to him, ignoring the wealthy, well-dressed parents around them. She looked at his drawing on the wall, then back at him, her eyes soft. "Leo," she said gently, "it's the most beautiful truck I have ever seen." She pulled out her old cracked phone and took a picture of him standing proudly next to his art. It's a hard truth that sometimes the people who are supposed to be there for us are the ones who let us down the most. But often, someone completely unexpected steps into that empty space. Have you ever had a Clara in your life? A friend, a teacher, or even a kind stranger who showed up and made you feel seen when no one else did? That one small act of showing up can change a person's entire world. That night, a thunderstorm raged outside, shaking the giant windows of the mansion. A loud clap of thunder woke Leo from a terrible nightmare. He cried out, a sharp, fearful sound. In the master suite down the hall, Richard Sterling slept soundly, his phone on silent. But Clara heard it. She was at his door in seconds, a small lamp casting a warm glow in the hallway. She didn't say anything, just sat on the edge of his bed while he caught his breath. She poured him a glass of water from the carafe on his nightstand. He drank it, his small hands still trembling. He looked at her calm face and kind eyes that asked for nothing. In the safety of that moment, after months of suffocating silence, a word escaped his lips. It was small, hoarse, and more of a breath than a sound. Clara. It was the first word he had spoken to anyone in almost a year. Hearing his own voice seemed to startle him. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she just smiled gently. A few weeks later, Richard came home unusually early from a canceled date. The house was quiet and he assumed Leo was asleep. As he walked past his son's room, he heard a sound, a soft whispering voice. He paused, frowning, and pushed pushed the door open a crack. The sight made him stop. Leo was sitting on the floor with Clara, a new drawing between them. He was pointing to a figure in the picture, and in a low, steady voice, he was explaining the story of the man in the rocket ship. He was talking, not just a word, but full sentences. Richard felt a strange, complicated pang in his chest. He saw his son, animated and happy, sharing his world with the housekeeper. A part of him knew he should go in, that this was a moment he should be a part of. But it felt like interrupting something private, a world he no longer belonged to. He quietly pulled the door closed, a bittersweet smile on his face. He's getting better, he thought, completely missing the truth. Leo wasn't just getting better, he had found a new family. The quiet world that Clara and Leo had built together was fragile, like a house of cards. It only took one careless breath from the outside world to bring it all tumbling down. That breath came in the form of a magazine cover. It was in a grocery store checkout line while Clara was buying lemons. Leo was with her, and his eyes, now so used to looking at the world again, landed on a picture of his father. Richard Sterling was on a yacht, laughing, with one model on his lap and another kissing his cheek. The headline, in huge, angry letters, read, "Billionaires' Wild Parties. Inside the life of a father forgets his son." Leo froze. He saw other people in the line glance from the magazine to him, their eyes full of pity and curiosity. He felt his face grow hot, and the silence he had fought so hard to escape came rushing back in, thick and suffocating. He didn't say a word for the rest of the day. The scandal was the only match needed to set Richard Sterling's world on fire. Suddenly, his private life was public entertainment. Paparazzi photographers hid in the bushes outside the mansion. News vans parked down the street. The models, once eager for the attention, were now either selling their stories or hiding. The mansion, which had briefly become Leo's safe haven, was now a fortress filled with the sound of Richard's rage. He was always on the phone, shouting at lawyers, agents, and publicists. He paced the floors like a caged animal, his face a permanent mask of fury. He was so consumed by the damage to his reputation that he barely noticed the damage being done. To his son, the one time he saw Leo looking sadly out the window, he just snapped, "Stop moping, Leo. It's just tabloid garbage. Show some strength." He didn't see a sad little boy. He saw another problem he didn't have time to deal with. Leo's voice, which had started to grow stronger every day, vanished completely. The light in his eyes went out. He stopped drawing. He stopped leaving his room for anything other than school, and even that became a nightmare. The whispers in the hallways were louder now. Kids would point at him in the cafeteria. One boy cruelly asked if he was going to get a new mom every week. It's a terrible feeling when the world judges you for something that isn't your fault. Kids can be especially cruel, repeating things they hear from adults without understanding the pain they cause. Have you ever had to stand up for someone or for yourself against unfair rumors and whispers? It takes a kind of courage that most adults don't even have. The silence that returned was different. Before, it had been a quiet shield against grief. Now, it was a wall built of shame. And this time, Leo built the wall to keep everyone out, including Clara. She would bring him his favorite snack, and he would turn his back. She would leave a new sketch pad on his desk, and it would remain untouched. She tried reading him a story, and he calmly got up, walked to his bed, and pulled the covers over his head. Her heart broke with every failed attempt. The simple, honest connection they had shared was gone, replaced by a deep, painful distance. She felt like she was watching him drown from the shore, and every time she tried to reach him, he would push her away. She was failing, and she had never felt so helpless. One afternoon, she couldn't find him anywhere. A rising panic filled her chest. She searched every room, calling his name softly, until she noticed that the door to his walk-in closet was shut. She knelt down and saw his small sneakers just under the door. He was hiding. Her first instinct was to open the door and pull him into a hug, but she knew that would only push him further away. So she did the only thing she could think of. She sat down on the floor, her back against the cool wood of the door, and she began to talk. She didn't talk about his father or the magazines. She told him a simple story about a little boat that got lost in a big, scary storm. The waves were huge, and the wind was loud, and the little boat was so scared it just closed its eyes and wished it could disappear. But the lighthouse on the shore never turned its light off, Clara whispered to the closed door. It just kept shining, waiting for the little boat to feel brave enough to look up again. She sat there for an hour, talking to the door, letting him know she was there. When she finally got up to leave, the door remained shut, but as she walked away, she heard the faintest click. The lock on the door had been turned. He wasn't ready to come out, but he was ready to let her in. The click of the unlocked door was a promise, a fragile truce in the war for Leo's heart. But that promise was shattered the next morning by the sound of a car horn, long and demanding, from the front gate. It was Eleanor, Leo's mother, and she had not come alone. She arrived with a sharp-suited lawyer and a television news van parked discreetly down the street. She swept into the mansion, her face a perfect mask of righteous anger. The confrontation with Richard was immediate and brutal. "I'm not not going to let my son live in the middle of your disgusting circus, Richard," she announced, her voice loud, enough for every employee, and for Leo, who was watching from the top of the stairs, to hear. "The court will see what you've become. I'm taking him back." She wasn't looking at Leo with love. She was looking through him, at Richard, her eyes flashing with the thrill of victory. Leo was a pawn in a game he never asked to play. That afternoon, he was packed into his mother's car, his small bag of clothes feeling heavier than it should. Her new house was smaller, cleaner, and colder than the mansion. It was a house for 2 people, not 3. That became clear when Leo, sitting in the unfamiliar living room, overheard his mother on the phone with her new husband. Her voice was no longer powerful and confident. It was pleading. "Robert, he needs us. No, it won't be forever, just until Richard is sorted out. I don't know where we'll put him. We'll figure it out. He's my son." Leo didn't need to hear the angry voice on the other end of the line to understand. His father didn't want him. His mother saw him as a prize to be won, and his new stepfather saw him as a problem to be solved. He was a piece of luggage that everyone was tired of carrying. The last flicker of hope in him died. At his father's house, there was Clara. Here, there was nothing. The wall of silence he had built around himself became a fortress of stone, impenetrable and absolute. He was completely out of Clara's circle now, a tiny island in a sea of angry adults. He ate what was put in front of him, slept when he was told, and moved through the days without a single word or expression. He felt like a ghost again, but this time, he didn't want to be found. He had been offered a mother's love, but it felt just as hollow and conditional as his father's. The world had shown him that love was a weapon, and he wanted no part of it. Clara had been let go. In the chaos of the custody battle, Richard had fired half the staff, seeing them as either potential witnesses for his wife or unnecessary expenses. She was heartbroken, not for the loss of her job, but for the loss of Leo. She saw the news reports, she read the cruel headlines, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that no one was thinking about the little boy at the center of the storm. They were thinking about money, reputation, and revenge. While Leo was being torn apart, she was on the outside, powerless to help. But Clara was not one to accept powerlessness. Driven by a desperate, fierce love, she formed a plan, a reckless, exhausting, and dangerous plan. She spent 2 days making phone calls, using a reference from a former employer. She found out that Eleanor and her new husband were looking for evening help, someone to cook and clean while they were out at social events. Clara went to the interview. Eleanor barely recognized her at first, seeing only a competent, quiet woman who was willing to work late for a modest wage. She was hired on the spot. Then Clara did something even harder. She called the agency that managed the Sterling Mansion's skeleton crew. She took the most undesirable job, the early morning shift, from 4 a.m. to 8 a.m., cleaning the public spaces of the mansion before Richard was even awake. She was risking everything. She was working nearly 18 hours a day, surviving on a few hours of sleep caught on a bus between the 2 houses. Her life became a grueling cycle of work, travel, and exhaustion, all for the chance to exist on the edges of Leo's life. It was a silent promise to the little boy who had no one else. "I am here. You are not alone." One night, about a week into her impossible new life, Leo came downstairs in his mother's house, unable to sleep. The house was dark and silent. He went to the kitchen for a glass of water, expecting to be alone with his sad thoughts. And then he saw her. Clara was standing at the sink, her back to him, carefully washing the dinner dishes. She looked tired, her shoulders slumped, but she was there. Leo stopped in the doorway, his heart frozen in his chest. It didn't make sense. She was supposed to be gone, a memory from his other life. He stood there for a full minute, just staring, unable to move or speak. Clara seemed to feel his presence. She turned around slowly, her hands dripping with soap. She saw him standing there, his eyes wide with disbelief. She didn't rush to him. She didn't speak. She just gave him a small, weary, and infinitely kind smile. It was a smile that said, "I will cross any ocean and fight any storm just to make sure you are safe." The quiet smile Clara gave Leo in his mother's kitchen was a bridge. For the first time in weeks, Leo walked across it. He didn't speak, not yet, but in the early mornings at the Sterling Mansion, he would come downstairs while Clara worked. He would sit at the huge kitchen island, a silent companion in the pre-dawn stillness, watching her polish silver that was never used. It was their new routine, a fragile peace in a world that had offered him none. This peace was shattered by the sudden strobing glare of red and blue lights washing over the kitchen walls. It was 4:30 a.m. Leo and Clara both looked out the massive windows to see 2 police cars and a black van swarming the front of the mansion, their lights slicing through the darkness. Men in dark jackets with FBI printed on the back moved swiftly toward the front door. There was no shouting, just a firm, insistent knock that echoed through the cavernous house. Richard Sterling, woken from his sleep, came downstairs in a silk robe, his face a mixture of confusion and arrogance. Through the glass panels of the front door, Leo watched watched as his father's expression morphed from anger to disbelief, and finally to a pale, slack-jawed fear as he was presented with a warrant. They put his hands behind his back, the sharp metallic click of the handcuffs a sound so small and yet so final. As they led him outside, the darkness erupted with the flash of cameras. Paparazzi, like vultures sensing a kill, had been waiting. Leo stood at the window, his small hand pressed against the cold glass, and watched his father, the most powerful man he knew, become just another man in trouble, swallowed by the flashing lights and the closing doors of a black van. He didn't feel sadness or anger. He felt nothing at all. By noon, the house was crawling with lawyers and government officials, and then his mother arrived. Eleanor walked in, her face set like stone, and for a moment a wild, impossible hope sparked in Leo's chest. Perhaps she was here to save him, but she didn't look at him. She walked straight to a tired-looking woman in a simple suit, a social worker named Mrs. Gable. "I want to be clear," Eleanor said, her voice crisp and devoid of emotion. "My circumstances have changed. I cannot provide a stable environment for him at this time." Mrs. Gable frowned. "Mrs. Vance, he's your son. His father has just been arrested on very serious charges. He needs his mother." Eleanor placed a perfectly manicured hand on her stomach. "And I need to protect my family. I'm pregnant, my husband, and I cannot have the stress of this chaos in our lives. We are starting over." The words hung in the air, colder and sharper than any slap. She was choosing a child that hadn't even been born over the one standing right in front of her. Leo finally understood. He was not a son. He was a chapter in a book she had finished reading and was now closing for good. They say blood is thicker than water. But what happens when blood abandons you? The legal system sees family as a name on a birth certificate, but we all know it's so much more than that. Has there ever been a time in your life when the person you truly considered family, the one who was your rock, had no legal or biological connection to you at all? Clara, who had been standing silently in the corner of the room, designated as nothing more than household staff, felt a surge of rage so pure it almost made her dizzy. But she was powerless. She had no rights here. She was just the maid. Mrs. Gable knelt down in front of Leo, her expression soft with a professional pity that felt almost as insulting as his mother's rejection. "Leo," she said gently, "you're going to have to come with me for a little while. We have a safe place for you to stay until we can figure things out." Leo didn't respond. He was a stone. He allowed himself to be led out of the house, his hand in the stranger's. As he stepped outside into the daylight, he didn't look back at the mansion that was no longer his home, or at the spot where his mother's car had been. He looked for the only thing that made sense, and he found her. Clara was standing on the sidewalk, having followed them out. She couldn't come any closer. A police officer held up a hand to stop her. She couldn't say anything. All she could do was stand there and watch as the little boy who held her entire heart was put into the back of a plain, government-owned car. He didn't cry. He didn't fight. He just stared at her through the back window as the car pulled away, his eyes locking with hers until the car turned the corner and he was gone. Clara watched the social worker's car disappear, and in that moment, the world snapped into a terrible, sharp focus. The grief that threatened to swallow her whole instead crystallized into a cold, hard certainty. Something was wrong. It was more than a faithless father and a selfish mother. She replayed the last few months in her mind, collecting scattered puzzle pieces. She remembered the venom in Eleanor's voice during a phone call she'd overheard, a snarled phrase about making Richard pay for every last thing. She remembered the deep, nervous sweat on the new husband's brow whenever the custody battle was mentioned. She remembered the French model from the news reports, Amélie, the same one who had briefly been a fixture at the Sterling mansion. It was all connected. Richard was foolish and reckless, but Clara felt in her bones that he was not cruel. This was a demolition, and Eleanor was holding the detonator. Her decision was not made with courage. It was made with the pure, non-negotiable love of a mother. The law saw a lost child. The world saw a scandal. Clara saw a war, and she was the only soldier fighting on Leo's side. She continued her grueling two-house work schedule, but now she was not just a housekeeper. She was a ghost with a purpose. At the Sterling mansion in the early mornings, she was invisible, cleaning up a life that had been shattered. But at Eleanor's house in the evenings, she became a spy, using her invisibility as her greatest weapon. She observed everything. She learned that Eleanor and her husband Robert always had a tense, whispered conversation in the home office after 10 p.m. She learned that Eleanor used a second, private laptop that she kept locked in a desk drawer. Her search was quiet and terrifying. Her tools were not gadgets, but a dust rag and a bucket. While dusting the office, her hand would brush against the locked drawer, testing its strength. While mopping the floors, she would pause outside the door, straining to hear fragments of their conversations. The risk was immense. Robert was constantly on edge and watched her with suspicious eyes. One evening, as she was wiping down the desk, she noticed the key to the drawer had been carelessly left on on the bookshelf. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Waiting until she heard the shower running, she unlocked the drawer with trembling hands. Inside was the laptop. She had only minutes. She powered it on, her mind racing, and found it was password protected, a dead end. But as she went to shut it, she saw a small sticky note on the underside, a series of numbers and a word: Leo, birthday 1108. Eleanor had used her abandoned son's birthday as the password for the very machine she used to destroy his. Life inside, she found everything. It was a digital treasure trove of pure malice. There were emails between Eleanor and Amélie, the French model, meticulously planning the abuse accusation. There were bank statements showing a wire transfer of $200,000 to Amélie's account, sent the day after the arrest. The subject line of the transfer was a single chilling word: performance. Eleanor had not only framed her ex-husband, but she had also paid the model Leo had met, using her as a weapon in a long gestating plan for revenge. As Clara stared at the screen, a floorboard creaked in the hallway. She slammed the laptop shut, locked the drawer, and slid the key back onto the shelf just seconds before Robert walked in, his eyes narrowing. "What are you still doing in here?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "Just finishing up," Clara said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. He knew something was wrong. The next day, he fired her, telling Eleanor she was making him uncomfortable. As he escorted her out, he leaned in close and whispered, "Whatever you think you know, you should forget it. People like you disappear all the time." The threat was real, but it was too late. Clara had already used her old phone to take pictures of every single piece of evidence. For 2 days, she lived in fear, looking over her shoulder, the threats from a rich, powerful man echoing in her ears. She could have vanished, taken the evidence and run, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw Leo's face in the back of that car, trusting her, his only anchor in the world. Her choice had been made long ago. The day of Richard Sterling's preliminary hearing was a media circus. He sat at the defendant's table, a shell of the man he once was, his case looking utterly hopeless. The prosecutor was laying out the airtight evidence against him. In the middle of the proceedings, a side door to the courtroom opened. It was Clara, dressed in her simple, clean clothes. She walked with a quiet, unshakable purpose straight to Richard's stunned defense attorney and handed him her phone. "Look at the pictures," she said simply. Bank statements, emails. It was a lie. The lawyer's eyes widened as he scrolled through the images. He stood up, interrupting the prosecutor, a new fire in his voice. "Your Honor," he announced, his voice booming across the silent room, "we have new evidence. Evidence of a conspiracy, perjury, and a malicious plot orchestrated by the alleged victim and—" He paused, then turned to point directly at Eleanor, who was sitting in the gallery with a smug look on her face. "Mrs. Eleanor Vance." Chaos erupted. Eleanor's face went white with panic. The judge hammered his gavel, shouting for order. Reporters scrambled. In that moment, the entire narrative of the Sterling scandal was rewritten, not by a billionaire or a high-powered lawyer, but by a housekeeper who was paid to be invisible. As police officers approached a sputtering, hysterical Eleanor, Richard Sterling looked across the mayhem of the courtroom. His eyes found Clara. He looked at this quiet, plain woman, and for the first time, he truly saw her. He saw the strength, the integrity, and the impossible courage. He owed her his life, but Clara wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were fixed on Mrs. Gable, the social worker, who was watching the proceedings in stunned silence. Clara's expression was a silent, desperate question. Where is Leo? Because for her, this was never about saving a billionaire. It was only ever about saving a little boy. The wheels of justice, once grinding slowly for a billionaire, turned with terrifying speed for a housekeeper. While Eleanor Vance was charged with conspiracy and perjury, she used her remaining influence for one last act of venom. She pressed charges against Clara for theft and illegal entry. The system, blind to motive and powered by procedure, saw a simple truth. Clara had broken the law. She had no high-priced attorney to argue the nuances of her heroism. She stood before a judge, a small, solitary figure, and listened as her actions were stripped of their love and labeled as crimes. When the sentence was handed down, 5 years in a state prison, a gasp went through the courtroom, but Clara did not cry. She looked towards the back of the room, where she saw Richard Sterling, a free man, walking out with his arm wrapped protectively around Leo. The boy was safe. He was with his father. A soft, serene smile touched Clara's lips. She had paid the price, and to her, it was a bargain. She happily accepted her fate. For the first time in over a year, Richard Sterling felt like a father. The scandal had stripped him of his arrogance, the trial had humbled him, and the near loss of his freedom had terrified him. He brought Leo home to a mansion that was no longer a stage for his ego, but a quiet place to heal. He canceled all his meetings. He turned off his phone. He spent hours just sitting with Leo, relearning the contours of his own son's face. He bought a new set of drawing pads and pencils and sat beside Leo while he drew, not saying much, just being present. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was comfortable. Leo, feeling the solid, grounding presence of his father, began to open up again. He smiled. He even laughed. Richard's heart swelled with a feeling he had mistaken for success but now recognized as love. He thought he had finally won. He had his son back. Everything was going to be perfect. 2 days after they returned home, Richard was showing Leo the plans for a new tree house he wanted to build in the backyard, a real one, with a rope ladder and a flag. He was pointing out where the windows would go, his voice full of excitement. "What do you think, son? We can build it together, just you and me." Leo looked at the plans, then up at his father, his expression serious and thoughtful. He was quiet for a long moment before he asked the question that would change everything. "Where is Clara?" The word hung in the air, simple and devastating. Richard froze, the blueprints trembling slightly in his hand. His lawyer, who was standing nearby reviewing some paperwork, stopped writing and looked down at the floor. The 2 remaining staff members in the hall, who had been quietly celebrating the return to normalcy, fell completely silent. The entire mansion seemed to hold its breath. It was a silence filled with 1,000 unsaid things. It was the shock of a billionaire who had just offered his son the world, only to find out his son wanted the one thing he had carelessly thrown away. Why would he ask for the maid, a poor, simple woman, when he had his powerful, wealthy father right here? That was the first arrogant thought that flashed through Richard's mind. But then came the second, heavier part of the silence, the deep, burning shame of knowing exactly where she was and why. In that deafening quiet, Richard Sterling finally understood. He saw the last year through his son's eyes. He saw a parade of beautiful, selfish strangers. He saw a father who was a ghost, a promise breaker who missed the most important night of his son's school life. He saw a mother who used him as a weapon and a new family that saw him as a burden. And through it all, he saw one constant, unwavering light, a quiet woman who left cookies on a table, who taped his drawings to the fridge, who showed up at the art show, who sat outside a closet door and told stories to the darkness, and who walked through fire to save them both. He hadn't just been saved by his housekeeper. His son had been raised by her. Leo wasn't asking for an employee. He was asking for his mother. The arrogance inside him finally shattered, replaced by a profound and painful clarity. He knelt down. In front of his son, the blueprints for a future Leo didn't want forgotten on the floor. He looked into his son's eyes, and for the first time he spoke with complete and utter honesty, his voice thick with a shame he knew he deserved. "She's in trouble, Leo," he said, his voice cracking. "She's in a bad place because she saved us, and I was so busy being happy we were free I let it happen." He had finally admitted his failure. He saw the flicker of understanding in his son's eyes. This was the real beginning, not with a treehouse, but with the truth. Richard took a deep breath, his purpose clear for the first time in his life. He wasn't just a billionaire, and he wasn't just a defendant. He was a father, and his family was broken. "So now," he said, his voice growing stronger with resolve, "we have a job to do. We have to go and save her, together." It took Richard Sterling less than 72 hours to move the mountain. The full force of his wealth, influence, and a new, burning sense of justice was a sight to behold. He hired a legal team that descended on the courthouse like a conquering army. They presented the evidence of Eleanor's conspiracy, the clear context of Clara's actions, and the gross miscarriage of justice. The charges were dropped. The conviction was expunged. The prison gates, which had seemed so final, swung open. When Clara stepped out into the sunlight, blinking against the brightness, the first thing she saw was Leo. He ran to her, his arms wrapping around her waist in a hug that was fierce and desperate. He didn't say a word. He just held on. Behind him stood Richard, watching not with the pride of a billionaire who had solved a problem, but with the humble gratitude of a man who was witnessing a miracle. Back at the mansion, the air was different. It was calm, finally at peace. Richard sat down with Clara in the living room, a place she had only ever cleaned. He placed a checkbook and a pen on the table between them. "I can never repay you, Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I want to try. Name a number, any number. I'll buy you a house, a business, anything you want. Your life is yours again. Please, let me give you the freedom you've given me." He pushed the open checkbook toward her. Clara looked at the blank check, then at Richard, and then at Leo, who was sitting close beside her. She gently pushed the checkbook back across the table. "No, thank you, Mr. Sterling," she said softly. Richard was stunned. "No? Clara, why? Why did you do all of it? Risking your job, your safety, even your life. For my son. For me?" The question he had been afraid to ask finally came out. He needed to understand the source of a loyalty so powerful it defied all logic. Clara took a deep, steadying breath, and for the first time, she spoke of the life she had kept locked away. "I had a daughter once," she began, her voice a quiet murmur. "I was young. I fell in love with a man who had the most wonderful smile. He was from a country far away. He promised me the world." She paused, her gaze distant. "He did not tell me he already had 6 6 other wives back in his village. I only found out after I was pregnant. She told them about the joy of the birth, a joy that lasted only 7 hours. She described being driven to the city center, her newborn baby girl wrapped in a thin hospital blanket, and being pushed out of the car. Her husband simply said, "My family will not accept her. You are on your own," and drove away, leaving her. On a cold, unforgiving sidewalk, she spoke of her impossible choice. She was alone, with no money, no food, and a tiny, fragile life in her arms. "I knew I could not save us both," she said, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "So I chose her. I walked to a church that had a shelter for children. I kissed her goodbye, and I left her there so that she might have a chance to live." She looked at Leo, her eyes full of a love that was a decade in the making. "I don't know her name. I don't know where she is. All I know is that I failed to protect her. When I saw you, Leo, so alone in this big house, I made a promise. Not to Mr. Sterling, but to my own little girl. I promised her that I would not let another child feel abandoned. Protecting you," she said, her voice breaking for the first time, "was the only way I could be a mother." The room was silent, filled with the weight of her sacrifice. Richard finally understood. It was never about money or a job. It was about a sacred promise. He slid the checkbook off the table and into a drawer, ashamed he had ever offered it. He looked at the quiet, dignified woman before him and made a different offer. "Don't work for us, Clara," he said. "Please, live with us. Let us be your family now." Leo looked up at her, his eyes pleading. "Please stay," he whispered. "I need you." Clara looked at the man who had finally learned to be a father and the boy who had taught her how to be a mother again. She nodded, a real, radiant smile finally breaking through her sadness. Richard stood up, his purpose clearer than it had ever been. He looked at Clara, his voice steady with a new, unbreakable promise. "You kept your promise to your daughter by saving my son," he said. "Now we will keep a promise to you." He knelt down, putting one hand on Leo's shoulder and looking directly into Clara's eyes. "We are going to find her." In the months that followed, the Sterling mansion transformed. The cold silence was replaced by the sound of Leo's laughter, the scent of Clara's baking, and the quiet hum of a house that had finally become a home. True to his word, Richard had hired a team of the world's best private investigators who were now discreetly and tirelessly searching for any trace of Clara's lost daughter. It was a slow, difficult process, a quiet promise being worked on in the background of their new lives. Clara, no longer a maid but the heart of their family, had found a measure of peace, but Richard saw a lingering sadness in her eyes and felt a persistent ache in his own heart. He looked at his son, happy and thriving, and still felt a piece was missing. In his mind, Leo had a father and a guardian, but he still lacked a mother. This one flawed idea took root in Richard's mind. He was a man who had spent his life building things, and he felt his family was still incomplete. Clara was family, yes, but he believed Leo deserved the structure of a normal life, with a mother who was also his father's wife. It was the last piece of his old, conventional thinking that he couldn't shake. He convinced himself that providing this final piece was his duty as a father, a way to fully erase the mistakes of his past. And so, with a heavy heart and a conflicted mind, he began to look back at the life he had left behind. He pulled out his old phone, the one filled with the numbers of beautiful women from around the world. He started making calls. The conversations were a painful reminder of the shallow world he once inhabited. Ingrid, the German model, was the first to reply. Her voice was syrupy sweet, immediately asking, "Richard, darling, I knew you'd come to your senses. When should we start planning the wedding?" She didn't ask about Leo once. He then met Tiffany, the model from California, for coffee. She spent 20 minutes outlining the media strategy for their power couple brand and suggested they trademark their names as a duo. Each call was the same. Some women were blatant about the financial security he offered. Others saw a chance to elevate their own fame. He could see through them all now. He saw the calculation in their eyes, the ambition, the complete and utter lack of genuine warmth for the little boy who was at the center of his world. Richard grew more and more frustrated. He knew, deep down, that none of them could offer Leo the pure, selfless love he received from Clara every single day. Yet, the stubborn idea persisted. He needed to provide a mother. He was trying to solve a problem of the heart with a business solution, just as he always had. If he couldn't trust their words, he decided, then he would have to test their actions. He needed to see them in person, to see how they behaved not just with him, but in Leo's presence. An idea began to form, a grand, theatrical plan that felt both logical and absurd. He would hold an audition. He scrolled through his list of over 20 models and selected 5. They were the most beautiful, the most charming, and the most convincing of the bunch. They were the best actresses in a play he was foolishly trying to stage. That evening, he stood in his home office, the place where he once ran his empire, and picked up the phone to call his personal assistant. "I need you to make some arrangements," he said, his voice voice firm, trying to convince himself this was the right thing to do. I'm hosting a small gathering here at the estate in 2 weeks. He paused, looking out the window at the garden below. Under the soft evening light, he could see Leo and Clara planting flowers together, their heads bent close, sharing a quiet laugh. They were a perfect picture of happiness. Richard watched them for a long moment, a pang of doubt in his chest, before turning back to the phone and pushing it aside. "Send invitations to these 5 women," he commanded. "Tell them it's a weekend affair. I want everything to be perfect." The grand ballroom of the Sterling mansion, which had been a place of silent grief and then quiet healing, was now a glittering stage. Music floated from unseen speakers, champagne flowed like water, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfumes. At the center of it all stood Richard Sterling, proud and confident, and beside him his 7-year-old son Leo, dressed in a small, perfect tuxedo. This was the culmination of Richard's grand plan, the final step in rebuilding his perfect family. And then they began to arrive. The 5 models, each one a vision of impossible beauty, swept into the room like queens taking their court. Ingrid, the German model, was the first. She enveloped Richard in a dramatic hug before kneeling down to Leo's level, her silk dress rustling. "My handsome little prince," she exclaimed, pinching his cheek a little too hard. Leo forced a smile, the scent of her jasmine perfume already making his head ache. Next came Amélie, the French model, who kissed the air on either side of his cheeks and whispered something in French he didn't understand. Tiffany from California immediately tried to take a selfie with him, telling him to make a cute face for the camera. The other 2 followed, a whirlwind of bright lipstick, sparkling jewelry, and loud, cheerful voices that felt like shouting. They all hugged him, touched his hair, and told him how adorable he was, but their eyes were always on his father. Leo felt like a doll being passed around, a prop in a play he hadn't auditioned for. His smile was a mask, carefully held in place because he knew it was what his father wanted. He felt trapped. Again and again, his eyes darted across the crowded room, searching for the one familiar anchor in this overwhelming sea of strangers. He found her near the grand fireplace, arranging glasses on a silver tray. Clara. She wore her simple black and white uniform, a stark contrast to the glittering gowns of the other women. She looked completely out of place, and yet to Leo, she was the only thing that felt real. She caught his gaze from across the room and gave him a warm, encouraging smile. It was a smile of pure, selfless love. Her eyes weren't filled with sadness or jealousy. They were filled with hope. Hope that this night would finally give him the happiness she felt he deserved. The love of a real mother. She thought this was for him, and her beautiful, tragic mistake made Leo's heart ache more than any of the model's fake affections. After an hour of strained conversation and forced pleasantries, Richard clinked a glass to draw everyone's attention. The music softened. The models gathered around him, their faces a mixture of practiced charm and nervous anticipation. Richard placed a heavy, meaningful hand on Leo's shoulder. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice echoing slightly in the suddenly quiet room. "This evening is about the future. It's about family. It's about finding the missing piece to our new life." He looked down at his son, his eyes full of love and a profound, misguided hope. "Leo," he said, his voice gentle but carrying the weight of a royal decree, "you have met all of these wonderful, kind women. They are all here because they want to be a part of our family. I need to know what you feel." He paused, the entire room leaning in. "Is there anyone here, anyone at all, that you feel a special connection with?" The question landed and the world stopped. The 5 models held their breath, their painted smiles frozen in place, but Leo wasn't looking at them. His gaze had drifted across the room and locked onto Clara. As his father's words echoed in his ears, his mind flooded not with images of the beautiful women before him, but with a vibrant tapestry of memories, each one a thread in the fabric of his salvation. He remembered the darkness of his closet, the terror of the thunderstorm outside, and the sound of Clara's voice, a calm, steady lighthouse in his storm, telling him a story through the closed door. And the little boat wasn't afraid anymore, because he knew the light was watching over him. He remembered standing alone in the school gymnasium, his heart a heavy stone of disappointment, watching the empty doorway where his father was supposed to be. And then he remembered the sight of Clara, breathless from running, her face the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, as she told him his drawing of a blue truck was a masterpiece. He remembered the first cookie, the first pencil, the first time she'd found him crying after a nightmare about his mother leaving. He remembered her wiping his tears, her hands gentle. He remembered what she had whispered to him that night, words that had patched the biggest hole in his heart. "Hush now. If you can give me a little smile, I promise I will be your mama for today. We can play, and I will hug you just like a mother would." She had said it to comfort him, a small, kind game, but to a little boy starved of love, it had been a sacred vow. She had kept that promise every single day since. His intense, unwavering stare did not go unnoticed. One of the models, following following his line of sight, frowned in confusion. "What is he looking at?" she whispered. Richard, seeing his son's complete focus, turned. He saw Leo staring at Clara with an expression of such profound love and longing that it stole the air from his lungs. The other models turned. The guests turned. A wave of silent realization washed across the opulent ballroom. Every eye in the room shifted from the boy to the maid. Clara, who had been watching with a hopeful smile, felt the sudden weight of dozens of stares. Her smile faltered, replaced by a look of utter confusion. Why was everyone looking at her? Her face paled as the horrifying implication began to dawn on her. Her hands flew to her apron, smoothing down the simple fabric in a nervous gesture. She wanted to shrink, to become invisible again, to run from the room. The music had stopped completely. The silence was absolute, a thick, heavy blanket of shock and disbelief. No one spoke, no one moved. In the center of that deafening silence, Leo's mind became perfectly clear. The memories had given him a strength he didn't know he possessed. He took one small, steadying breath. Then, with a quiet dignity that was far beyond his years, he deliberately turned his back on his billionaire father and the 5 beautiful, stunned models. He faced the heart of the room, faced the woman who had been his light in the darkness. He took a single, determined step forward, and then another. He began to walk, his small shoes making no sound on the plush carpet, moving with an unshakable purpose across the silent ballroom, directly toward Clara. The space between Leo and Clara seemed to stretch for an eternity. Every eye in the ballroom, 100 lenses of judgment and disbelief, followed the small boy in the tuxedo as he closed the distance. The models stood like beautiful, useless statues, their painted smiles beginning to crack. Richard Sterling's face was a storm cloud of confusion, his grand plan crumbling into nonsense before his very eyes. Leo reached Clara. He didn't wrap his arms around her. He simply reached out and took her index finger with his small hand, a gesture of such simple, profound trust that it was more intimate than any embrace. Clara flinched as if his touch were electric. She looked down at his hand holding hers, her mind a blank slate of pure, unadulterated shock. She was the maid. He was the master's son. This was not supposed to happen. The fragile silence was shattered by a shrill, nervous laugh. It was Ingrid. "Leo, darling, what is this silly game?" she called out, her voice dripping with forced sweetness. "Come back over here. We have cake." Tiffany joined in, taking a step forward. "Yes, sweetie, come to... Your father is waiting." They began a desperate, pathetic performance, a chorus of fake mothers calling for a son who was not theirs, promising toys and treats, their words a hollow echo in the vast, tense room. They were trying to prove their worth, to show they were the rightful choice, but their actions only exposed the gaping void where their sincerity should have been. Leo ignored them completely. He held Clara's finger a little tighter, drawing strength from the connection. He turned his head slightly, not looking at his father or the models, but addressing the entire world. His voice, though small, was clear and did not tremble. It cut through the cloying sweetness of the models' calls like a knife. "She is my mother." For a second, the universe seemed to stop. Then it exploded. A collective, audible gasp swept through the guests, and from the garden, a blinding supernova of light. The terrace doors burst open as a swarm of paparazzi, who had been waiting for the money shot of a billionaire and his new model fiancée, surged into the room. The rapid-fire click, click, click of their cameras was like gunfire, the flashes turning the scene into a series of stark, overexposed still frames of shock and horror. Clara's face was a mask of terror. Richard's was a portrait of pure fury. The models were twisted into ugly snarls of jealousy. Richard Sterling's public image and private fantasy were being incinerated in real time. The humiliation was a white-hot poker in his gut. His authority, his control, his entire world had been upended by a 7-year-old boy and a housekeeper. His carefully constructed composure shattered, and the old arrogant billionaire roared to the surface. "Enough!" His voice boomed over the clicking cameras, a thunderclap that momentarily silenced the chaos. His rage was not directed at his son. It was aimed like a weapon at the terrified woman standing beside him. "You!" he snarled at Clara, his finger jabbing in her direction. "What have you done? What twisted ideas have you been putting in my son's head? This is over. Get out of my house now!" Clara physically recoiled, her hand flying to her mouth as she stumbled backward, pulling her finger from Leo's grasp. Fear, stark and absolute, radiated from her. She looked like a cornered animal, ready to flee, but before she could turn, Leo stepped in front of her, planting his small feet and creating a human shield. He faced his father, a tiny warrior against a titan, and the sound that came out of him was not a child's cry, but a raw, guttural roar of pure love and rage. "No!" The single word silenced the paparazzi, the guests, his father, everyone, and then the tears came, hot and furious, streaming down his face as he finally unleashed the truth he had carried alone for so long. "You don't know anything," he sobbed, his small fists clenched at his sides. You weren't here, she was. When you were gone with them, he gestured wildly at the models. She was the one who sat with me. When you forgot the art show, she came. She took 2 buses to come and see my Kai. Drawing. His voice grew stronger with every memory he unearthed. She told me stories when I had nightmares. She made me cookies. She taught me how to draw a rocket ship. He took a ragged breath, preparing to drop the bomb he knew would destroy what was left of his father's ignorance. She worked 2 jobs for me, he screamed, the accusation ringing through the ballroom. She worked here in the morning when you were sleeping, and she worked at Mom's house at night. She never slept. She did that so I wouldn't be alone. She did that because she loves me and you weren't even here to see it. As Leo spoke, the models began to sneer. This is ridiculous, one of them muttered. The family is insane. Another scoffed loudly. To be rejected for a maid? How utterly pathetic. And with a flick of her hair, she turned and stormed out, the others following like a pack of disgruntled wolves, leaving the raw, exposed heart of the family drama for the cameras to devour. Richard's fury had vanished, sand-blasted away by the terrible, beautiful truth of his son's words. Every sentence was a blow, dismantling his pride and exposing the depth of his failure. He was seeing his own story for the first time, and he was the villain. He stared, speechless, as his son, the little boy he thought he was protecting, stood as the sole protector of the only person who had truly earned the title of mother. Leo's chest was heaving, his face tear-streaked but resolute. He looked from his broken father to the crying, overwhelmed woman behind him, and then back. He delivered his final world-altering ultimatum, his voice no longer a shout, but a statement of absolute, unbreakable fact. I want her to be my mother, and if you won't marry her, then I don't want you to be my father either. Leo's ultimatum struck his father with the force of a physical blow. The flashing cameras, the shouting reporters, the shocked faces of the remaining guests, it all dissolved into a meaningless, silent blur. The only thing Richard Sterling could hear was the echo of his son's final words, a judgment more absolute than any court could deliver. I don't want you to be my father either. His heart didn't just break. It felt as though it had stopped completely, frozen by the terrifying prospect of losing the one thing his money could not buy back. In that moment of pure, undiluted fear, his world was stripped down to the 3 people standing in the center of the floor, a triangle of pain and desperate love. His eyes, full of a dawning horror, moved from his son's defiant, tear-streaked face to the woman Leo was protecting. He looked at Clara, and then he melted. The last vestiges of his pride, his anger, his humiliation, all dissolved under the weight of a sudden, overwhelming epiphany. As he truly looked at her for the first time, not as an employee or a problem or a savior, but as a person, his own memories began to surface, a quiet, gentle tide against the raging storm of the evening. He remembered the countless early mornings. He'd come downstairs to find coffee already brewed, exactly the way he liked it, without ever having to ask. He remembered a time, months ago, after a brutal negotiation had failed, when he had returned home defeated, and she had simply placed a glass of water beside him and said, "Tomorrow will be a better day, Mr. Sterling." It was a small gesture, one he hadn't even consciously registered at the time, but he now realized it was the only moment of genuine comfort he'd received in years. He remembered the sound of her quiet humming as she worked, a peaceful melody that had slowly, imperceptibly, chased the ghosts out of the mansion's empty hallways. He had never felt that she was just a maid. There had always been something more, a feeling of rightness, of calm, a connection he had been too arrogant and too blind to ever acknowledge. It wasn't just his son who needed her. He needed her too. Just as this profound, life-altering realization crested in his soul, the silence was shattered by a voice as cold and sharp as breaking ice. "Richard, that is quite enough." All heads turned. Standing near the grand staircase were his parents, Elizabeth and Richard Sterling Sr., the patriarch and matriarch of the Sterling dynasty. They had been watching the entire debacle from the shadows, their faces etched with a disgust so profound it was terrifying. Elizabeth Sterling, a woman who looked as if she were carved from marble, took a step forward, her eyes bypassing Leo completely and landing on Clara with laser-like contempt. "Have you lost your senses?" she hissed, her voice low but carrying across the room. "Are you truly going to let a hysterical child and this servant burn down everything our family has built?" Her husband stepped beside her, his face purple with rage. He was a man who believed in bloodlines and legacies above all else. He pointed a trembling finger at Clara. "The boy is confused, Richard. He needs a doctor. But you, to even entertain this madness is a disgrace. She is a black woman, a housekeeper. You would shame the Sterling name by allowing this farce to continue for one more second?" The racist, classist poison in his words dripped into the air. The true, ugly foundation of their world finally laid bare. The paparazzi, sensing the conflict, escalating to an even more scandalous level, surged forward, their cameras flashing relentlessly. "This This was the story of the decade. Richard's mother saw her opportunity to end it. "This is your last chance to choose, Richard," she declared, her voice ringing with the finality of a death sentence. "You will dismiss this woman, discipline your son, and fix this mess, or you will choose them. But if you choose them, you are no longer our son. This family, your inheritance, the sterling name, we will leave you forever. You will be nothing." The choice was laid before him: a kingdom of cold, loveless legacy, or a family of three standing in the ruins of a disastrous party. Richard looked at his parents, at their hard, unforgiving faces, and saw his own past, a world of empty transactions and conditional love. It was a prison gilded in gold. He then turned and looked at his son. Leo was watching him, his small chest heaving, his eyes pleading, offering not an empire but a single priceless thing, a chance to be his father. Finally, Richard's gaze rested on Clara. She wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were fixed on Leo, her expression one of pure, selfless, heartbreaking love. She was terrified for him, not for herself. In that instant, Richard Sterling was reborn. A quiet, unshakable calm settled over him. He turned, not to his parents, but to the swarm of photographers. "Out," he said, his voice not a roar, but a command of absolute authority. "Security, clear the room. Everyone out now." The effect was immediate. His security team, sensing the shift in their employer, moved with brutal efficiency, pushing the stunned paparazzi and lingering guests out of the ballroom and locking the doors behind them. The room was plunged into a heavy, ringing silence, broken only by Leo's soft sniffles. Richard stood tall, a king who had finally chosen his kingdom. He faced his parents, his expression unreadable. "Then I am nothing," he said, his voice quiet but final. He watched their faces crumble in disbelief, but he felt no satisfaction, only a sense of profound relief, as if he had just shed a heavy skin he had been wearing his entire life. He walked past them without another glance. He crossed the floor and knelt, so he was on the same level as the two people who mattered. He looked at Clara, and for the first time he let the affection he felt show in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered, a lifetime of apology in 2 words. Then he turned to the trembling boy who had been braver than he ever was. His face, now cleared of all anger and confusion, was filled with a love so pure it was almost painful to see. A slow, gentle smile spread across his lips. He looked at the small, empty space between the boy and the woman he loved. "Son," he said, his voice soft and full of wonder, "do you don't want to hug your new actually beloved mother?" For a moment there was only the sound of a little boy's heart beating against the woman he had chosen. Leo buried his face in Clara's simple uniform, his small body finally relaxing in an embrace that felt like coming home. Richard watched, his own heart aching with a beautiful, cleansing pain. He had his son back, he had a family. It was enough, but for Leo it was not. He pulled back from the hug, his eyes still shining with tears, but his expression was one of absolute seriousness. He looked up at Richard, his hand still firmly holding Clara's. "Marry her," he said, his voice clear and strong. "Right now." The shock that had just begun to recede came crashing back like a tidal wave. Richard's mother let out a strangled gasp. His father looked as if he might actually faint. Even Richard was taken aback by the sheer force of his son's conviction. It was an impossible, absurd demand. And yet, as Richard looked from his son's determined face to Clara's stunned, beautiful one, he realized it was the only thing that made any sense. It was the final, unbreakable seal on their new family. He held Clara's gaze, asking a silent question. She was trembling, overwhelmed, but as she looked at the little boy who had fought a war for her, she gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the permission he needed. Richard turned to his lawyer, who was still standing by, looking utterly bewildered. "David," Richard said, his voice ringing with a newfound authority that had nothing to do with money. "You heard him. Get the marriage license. I don't care what you have to do, who you have to call. We're getting married tonight." David stared, speechless, then scrambled for his phone, recognizing an order he could not refuse. The ceremony that followed was the strangest in the history of high society. It took place in the wreckage of a grand ballroom, under the harsh glare of utility lighting, witnessed only by a flustered lawyer and 2 disowned, hate-filled parents who were forced to watch. There was no music, no flowers, no white dress, but as Richard Sterling took Clara's hand and they repeated their vows, a quiet, simple promise in the midst of the chaos, it was more real and more sacred than any royal wedding the world had ever seen. Their new life began that night, a life that was at once both blissfully happy and profoundly sad. Happy because for the first time the 3 of them were a true family. The mansion, once emptied of guests and staff, became their sanctuary. They ate breakfast together, Richard helped Leo with his homework, and Clara's quiet humming became the house's permanent soundtrack. They were settled, they were whole, but outside their gates a war of words was raging. Eleanor and Richard's parents launched a vicious media campaign, painting Clara as a manipulative gold digger who had bewitched a troubled child and a weak-willed killed man. They fed the tabloids an endless stream of lies and fake allegations, trying to poison the world against them. Yet a strange and wonderful thing happened. The world didn't buy it. The story of the little boy who rejected immense wealth and power to choose the quiet housekeeper who had shown him kindness had leaked from the party. The image of their desperate, chaotic wedding, captured by a long lens camera, became a symbol not of scandal but of authentic love. People saw the truth. They saw a story of a real family being forged in the fire, and they overwhelmingly supported them. Talk shows debated it, social media championed them, and for once the public chose the side of the heart over the side of the headline. But Richard, Clara, and Leo were finished with headlines. They realized the life they were meant to live wasn't in that mansion, surrounded by the ghosts of their past and the noise of the outside world. Their life was on the road, on a mission, together. They put the Sterling Empire into a trust, packed a few simple bags, and walked away from the wealth. In the drama, leaving it all behind. Their new life had only one purpose: to fulfill the promise Richard had made to Clara. Their journey to find her daughter began. It took them to dusty records offices, to quiet towns where whispers of the past still lived, and to the doors of strangers. They followed a promising lead to a small city in the Midwest, to an adoption agency that had been run by the church where Clara had left her baby. But the lead turned to chaos. The agency's records had been sealed decades ago. The director, citing privacy laws, refused them access. They learned the child had been adopted by a powerful, reclusive family who had vanished years ago, leaving a trail of dead ends and legal brick walls. The search was not a simple quest. It was a labyrinth, and they were just beginning to understand its complexity. Their search for Clara's lost daughter has only just started, and the path is already guarded by secrets and powerful forces who want the past to stay buried. They thought they had fought their biggest battle, but they are about to discover that finding a lost child can mean starting a new war, a war where their love and resolve will be tested in ways they can't even begin to imagine. The story of what happens next is a story for another day.